Hi students, this video is about satire and Canterbury tales. It will take terms, satirical terms that you learned about last year, and will show you how those terms apply to the tales themselves. This will help you both with your video project and also with the literary analysis that you have to write tomorrow. So the first terms that we're going to take a look at are irony, specifically verbal and situational irony. So let's take a look for them in the excerpt on the prioress. The excerpt reads, "There was also a nun, a prioress, but to speak about her moral sense, she was so charitable and solicitous. She had some little dogs that she fed on roasted flesh, our milk, and fine white bread." So where does the verbal irony occur? It occurs in the third line here. She was so charitable and solicitous. Now, verbal irony occurs when the writer states one thing, but actually means the opposite. So here, while Chaucer calls her charitable, he actually believes that she is greedy. Now, the reason why we know that this line must be verbal irony is because these last two lines somewhat contradict the idea of being charitable. Yes, she's feeding her little dogs really fancy food. But we have to keep in mind this is occurring during times of great poverty where people were quite literally starving to death. Therefore, by feeding this food to her little dog, the nun is actually being quite selfish by taking care of her little puppies at the expense of starving people. Therefore, this shows that Chaucer does not actually believe this about her. He's instead using verbal irony. Now, this also plays into the situational irony. Readers would believe that a nun would be charitable and would be moral and would help those in need. But what we're actually getting is the fact that we have this very vain woman who prefers to have little trinkets and believe in love and take care of her little puppies. So remember, situational irony is when you expect one thing, but you get quite the opposite. Now, why does Chaucer do this? Why doesn't he just straight up say, "This woman is the worst"? Well, it's part of satire. The idea is that Chaucer is not going to come out and directly insult the church. Therefore, he uses irony to kind of appease people who support the church. They would read this and say, "Oh yes, the nun is great." But people who might agree with him or might be able to be persuaded by him would read this and see that it was irony. They would see that he's actually insulting the church. And therefore, he can insult the church without getting into too much trouble, but also by still making points to his readers who agree with him. And therefore, that's how he's using irony here. So if you need to read a little more about how the prioress is being satirized, you can pause and read over this slide. However, what I'd like for you to do now is to pause this video, read this excerpt on the monk, and see if you can't find the verbal and situational irony yourself. So go ahead and pause the video and look for it. So where the verbal irony occurs is kind of in the entire thing with these rhetorical questions and the answer. So Chaucer asks, what do you expect of this monk? Do you expect him to look upon books and study? Do you expect him to work really hard? And then Chaucer says, of course not. This monk should be able to own greyhounds and birds, and he should be able to hunt and ride and have fun. He's a monk. Let him have the time of his life. But of course, Chaucer doesn't actually believe that. He believes that monks should be studying books and should be laboring and should be helping people. And therefore, he uses this verbal irony to say one thing when he means quite the opposite. Again, this plays into situational irony. We expect the monk to be a very holy man, charitable, thinking of others, helping those in need. But what we get is actually quite the opposite. And again, this plays into Chaucer's very subtle insults towards the church of that time period. So now that we've talked about verbal and situational irony, let's move on to the next term, which is going to be hyperbole and exaggeration. So exaggeration is exaggeration. It is its own definition. However, remember that hyperbole is when you exaggerate something to an impossible standard. So let's take a look at this excerpt on the friar. He knew the taverns well in every town, and every innkeeper and barmaid too, better than lepers, beggars, and that crew. So where does the hyperbole occur for the friar? It occurs right here where it says every. He's been to every single tavern in every single town and has met every single innkeeper and every single barmaid. That's not actually possible. There's too many of those for him to actually have gone to and met. What this is doing is the hyperbole is emphasizing how kind of indulgent and corrupt the friar is. He drinks a lot, and it kind of also implies that he sleeps around a lot. Therefore, the hyperbole is working to show that the friar just doesn't happen to do this once or twice. He does this a great deal, and therefore can be concluded as a very corrupt figure within the church. So go ahead and pause the video because I would like for you to look for how hyperbole is used in this excerpt on the night. Pause the video, figure out where it is, and then we'll review. So here, the hyperbole operates very similar. It's in this word everywhere. Here it is saying that the knight has ridden everywhere and has been honored everywhere for his worthiness. Here the hyperbole is working a little different than the friar. With the friar, the hyperbole works to satirize and criticize him. The knight is actually not really being criticized. The hyperbole is somewhat working outside of satire. It's essentially just showing that he is as knightly as a knight can be. Everyone finds him worthy. Now, everyone might not actually find him worthy because he hasn't met everyone. But it's emphasizing the idea that he is so good that everyone could potentially find him honorable and worthy. And therefore, it's emphasizing his nobility. So one thing that you'll notice that Chaucer does is that he just doesn't have someone who's lusty. He has the lustiest of lusty people. And he just doesn't have someone who's noble. He has someone who's the most noble of all noble people. And you'll see that with all of the characters where they're very polarized. They're either just very, very negative or very, very positive. So now that we've talked about hyperbole and exaggeration, let's move on to caricature. So let's take a look for caricature in this excerpt on the squire. It reads, "With him there was his son, the knight's son, a youthful squire, a lover and a lusty bachelor, with locks well curled, as if they'd laid in a press. With 20-some years of age he was, I guess." So with the squire, we see caricature, especially in this line, with locks well curled, as if they'd laid in press. Now remember that caricature is when you take physical or personality qualities of an individual and you emphasize them, either to ridicule those qualities or to kind of poke fun, which is a little more lighthearted version of ridicule. So here, Chaucer is characterizing the squire as being very concerned with his own looks, where he spends potentially hours making sure that his hair is curled and laying perfectly upon his shoulders. Therefore, the squire, he's ironically characterized as kind of being vain and into his looks, which is ironic because his father is the most noble of noble men, and therefore the squire is very much not following in his father's footsteps. He is instead attracted to the romantic qualities of chivalry as opposed to the noble qualities of chivalry. So now let's take a look. If you want to read more on the squire, here's your slide. But if you could pause the video and take a look at this excerpt on the wife of Bath. Try to find where the caricature occurs in here. So the caricature occurs here where it says, "A rug was tucked around her buttocks large," and also in company well could she laugh her slurs." So here, what the wife of Bath is being characterized as is a very large, jovial, gregarious woman who drinks a lot and likes to laugh and drink in the tavern. And so therefore, by emphasizing these aspects of her personality and actions and also her physical state, we see a caricature which is emphasizing the qualities that Chaucer wants to ridicule about these characters. So now that we've gone over caricature, let's turn to reversal. Now, reversal might be a new one for some of you guys. So reversal occurs when you have some type of order or hierarchy. So for instance, people eat dinner before dessert. The king is considered higher than the peasants. Reversal occurs when you change these expected hierarchies around, where somebody might eat dessert before dinner, or the peasant might be somehow higher than the king. That is reversal. So let's take a look at this excerpt and see how reversal occurs. "He loved God most, and that with his whole heart, at all times, though he played or plied his art, and next his neighbor even as himself. He'd thresh and dig with never thought of pelf, for Christ's own sake, for every poor wight, all without pay, if it lay in his might." So here this describes the plowman, the honest worker, God-loving, and prompt gentleman. And it talks about how he's actually a man of God, and how he's actually a hard worker, and how he's actually a really good person. The reason why this is using reversal is if we think about all the other examples that we've read, all the other excerpts, we've had the monk and the friar and the nun. Now, these people who you would expect within the hierarchy of the church to actually be people of God, who are charitable and giving and hard workers, instead of them actually fulfilling that role, we have the plowman, somebody who's very low in the social hierarchy. Therefore, we have reversal, where within the hierarchy, those who we expect to be good are not good, and those who we expect to be not good are actually good. This plays around with the ideas of the three estates. So Chaucer believes that the three estates were essentially a farce and didn't actually denote any characteristics of individuals, where he saw both good and bad in all of the estates. And therefore, with this reversal, he's proving the point that no matter what estate you're in, you can't necessarily guarantee that someone will be good or bad, because the plowman is actually one of the best characters in the tales, while the characters who we expect to be good are actually not. So now we're going to look at our second to last term, which is incongruity. So let's take a look at this first instance, which is about the friar, who we've already talked about. It reads, "For many a man there is so hard of heart, he cannot weep however pains may smart. Therefore, instead of weeping and of prayer, men should give silver to poor friars all bare." So incongruity occurs when something is very much out of place. Therefore, incongruity is a type of irony. So here we see that it's saying that the friar has trouble. He has trouble with weeping, and he has trouble with prayer. He's not a very emotional man. Therefore, if you really want to help him, just give him some money. This is incongruous. This is not what we expect to occur in this situation. Therefore, yes, it is situational irony, but it's also the idea of being misplaced. We don't expect this line to be here, and therefore the line itself is an example of incongruity. Now let's take a look at this second excerpt, which is about the prioress, and try to find where the incongruity occurs here. So the incongruity occurs here, where it says amor vinci omnia. Sorry if I mispronounced that. However, what it means is that love conquers all. This is, again, an instance of incongruity. It doesn't belong here. The prioress should say something along the lines of God conquers all. But instead, she believes in love above all else. So again, this goes along with situational irony, because incongruity also often is situational irony. But here, this is very misplaced. It doesn't belong within this character, and therefore incongruity is occurring. So last but not least, let's talk about parody. So you're not really going to see a lot of parody in the prologue. However, some of the stories are a parody. So for instance, while Chaucer is very kind to the knight and doesn't satirize the knight directly, the story about the knight is a parody. Chaucer is mimicking the tales that he heard about knights, and he's using things such as hyperbole and caricature to poke a little fun at the knights and how they see chivalry. So for instance, in the story, the knights go to this great battle where they're going to joust and they're going to have sword fights with each other, and they're going to see who is the strongest and best knight of them all. But the thing is that they all know not to kill each other. So they have this sword fight, and they're like, oh, I will win. But they know that no one's allowed to actually hurt the other person. Therefore, Chaucer kind of depicts these guys very subtly as a bunch of guys playing with sticks, where they're having sword fights to show that they're noble, but in reality, there's nothing really that scary or noble about it. And therefore, Chaucer writes a parody about these knights' tales to kind of point out how silly they are and not really true to reality. So make sure when you're reading your tale, ask yourself, is this parody? All right, so those are all the terms and how they operate in the Canterbury Tales. Make sure you're ready to find them yourself in tomorrow's excerpt. All right, thanks so much for listening. Bye.